today we're going to talk about interviews by looking at a case of a paper, well, not really a case, so looking at a paper that uses interviews that I wrote. Again, it's sometimes easier just to use your own examples. So this is a paper that I wrote on referendum resource officers in the 2007 Ontario referendum and electoral reform. Very, very important stuff. Sorry, it is important, but the title is a bit off-putting. But anyway, point being, it's a paper that was published. So essentially, remember how I was talking last week about how BC's referendums failed on electoral reform? And then I was talking, like, I think in the very first class, we did that little experiment where I showed you the experiment. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot for many, many years, is why does electoral reform continually fail in Canada? It never, like, even in 2015, this will be the last election under first past the post, and then that just obviously didn't change. So I found that really fascinating for a number of years. So a long time ago, I did a research paper looking at referendum resource officers. So these were the people who, during the Ontario referendum on electoral reform, were tasked with educating the population. And I was like, okay, like if we can figure out from them what the major issues are, then maybe I can have a better understanding of what needs to be tested. So we're going to backtrack a bit and go to 2014 when this is published on referendum resource officers, which looked at those people who are doing the education campaigns for the Ontario referendum. So let's go back to how I went about doing it as an example of how to do interview methodology. All right, so first of all, what is the research question? So in this case, I was interested in the question, how does public education impact referendums on electoral reform? How did those referendum resource officers, so they were one person in every riding who was tasked with educating the population, how did they contribute to the public education of the Ontario population? So I was thinking, okay, who might have an answer to this question? Ding, ding, ding. I was like, I should talk to the referendum resource officers. There was 108 of them, so that was the size of the population. And they were all people who had worked in each riding on the referendum. And so then I was like, okay, well, how will I access these people? And so I started off looking at news reports about them, because oftentimes they would go in the news and say, hey, everybody, we have a referendum going on. So I was able to get their names and sometimes their contact info. And then I thought I could just talk to Elections Ontario and see if they'll just give me their names and contact info. They didn't originally, but then eventually they did. And the other way that I was able to access people was through snowball sampling. So we'll talk about that next week. Essentially, once I talked to one referendum resource officer, they would say, hey, like, I know somebody else who is doing it during this campaign. Do you want to talk to them? And because I got that personal introduction, they would be more likely to talk. So then before I talked to each of these people, I needed to get a sense of, what do I really want to know? What topics need to be addressed? What issues are less important if we run out of time? Or you also don't want your interview to take forever because people get bored. And so I really had to think through very strategically about what my list of questions were. Pro tip, don't use yes or no questions. I also did kind of like a pre-survey ahead of time so I could get all of that kind of demographic info, like how old are you? Are you a male or female? What's your day job? That kind of thing, because not all of them were always referendum resource officers. So I made an interview instrument. This is one of their names. So I took a look. I got some demographic info originally, and then I got some open-ended questions about their background, how they were recruited, their training materials, what sort of duties they were doing, and then if they could reflect on what ways their role was successful, was unsuccessful, what they might change about their duties. So I built an interview instrument that was semi-structured, meaning that I was okay to ask follow-up questions if need be, but I had a general structure of how I wanted this interview to go. So I will pop this on the Moodle so that you can see what this looks like. The next task was to figure out what was the most appropriate time and location for the interview. it just made sense to conduct the interviews via phone. I had something cool that you could like stick into your telephone and then stick into your computer that I was able to record them. And we had a variety of different times, but we did it all within a few weeks as I was able to get a hold of each of these people. And the best location was to do it by phone. And so I took really good notes and then transcribed those interviews, which takes a very long time. And then from there, I was able to do analysis to figure out, okay, what are some of the main things that we should be looking at in terms of referendum resource officers and in terms of public education about electoral reform? And you can read the full article to see that analysis here. And sorry if you hear crinkling. Zoe the cat is currently playing underneath my chair. Okay, so this is the point where if we were in class, I would get you each to do your own interview framework and then interview each other to have that experience. We obviously can't do that. So go through, come up with your own example, and then that'll be part of the assignment for the coming week. So let's talk, though, a little bit about the pros and cons of using interviews to collect data. All right, so what are the upsides? So the first is that interviews are usually very key to explanatory research. So things like, why was this decision made? What were the circumstances surrounding that particular event? And I think this was really key in my particular research area for me to talk to people first before I started testing theories about why the referendum failed. And so it's actually a really cool example because you can see this particular paper, I am doing the explanatory or the exploratory as well research. I'm trying to get a sense of what theories should I be testing. And I really come out of this with a sense that it's the public education. And that's, of course, what leads to the paper that's the experiment, looking at different literacy levels and different modes of education and information about electoral reform. So this is a really good example of how, we go back up here, how some inductive research on the referendum led to more deductive hypothesis testing research about the role of information. Okay, the other thing is that interviews are much better than, say, survey research for small or hard to reach population groups, especially elites or groups that you can't just do a general population survey and get a sense. If you have really specific targeted people who are going to be in the best position to respond to your questions, then interviews might be a good way to go about it. Some downsides, it is very time consuming. You have to schedule them, you have to do the interviews themselves, you have to transcribe them. So rather than just asking somebody to fill out a survey online where you just kind of get the data almost instantaneously, interview research is very labor intensive. The other thing is that especially if they're looking at an interviewer, so if you're like in person in front of them, they might not always be entirely truthful, especially if they think that there's a chance that their name is going to be attached to it. So for the referendum resource officers, they had a choice whether they wanted their name to be attached to it or not. A lot of them said, sure, I'll put my name to this. Others said, no, I'll stay anonymous, thanks. But still, there's this sense that when you know exactly who you're talking to, people can be a little less honest and try to, or just more so try to present themselves in the best light. So there, like any other forms of data collection, there are always pros and cons. The other form of data collection that we are looking at this week, besides interviews, is focus groups, which are quite related. And so for the example for this is, I've actually never done focus group research. So we're going to use an example from Louise Carvert. And she wrote this book right here, on rural women leadership in Atlantic Canada. And essentially she was looking at this question of the gender imbalance in politics. So let's just read, right here. So this is just from the synopsis. So essentially, most people are aware of the large and persistent gender imbalance in elected office in all levels of government in Canada, but few appreciate the far greater imbalance that occurs outside of large cities. So essentially, she noticed this phenomenon that outside of large cities, this gender imbalance, so usually less women than men participating in politics as electoral officials, tends to occur. And she says, okay, well, this is not necessarily because rural voters are biased against women, but just because there are so few women, so few female candidates who are running in seats where they could possibly win. Winnable seats just meaning seats that, it's actually possible. It's not like you have every election 90% votes conservative and you are the NDP candidate, And so it's this question of who is this pool then of potential candidates? So not just looking at the people who run, but the people who might run. And so what she did is she did small groups of rural community leaders in a focus group and interviewed them, and also did a group discussion about the experiences and their perceptions of them. And provides a picture then of how there might be barriers towards the election of women, especially in rural Canada, especially in Atlantic Canada. Okay, so her research question then, she was interested in this question of, why are there so fewer women in politics in elected office in rural Atlantic Canada? Her subjects for her focus group then were these women, both those who have run, and then also those who seemed like potential good candidates, but then chose not to run. And she makes these findings that it's about the issues with family life, work, and the overall local economy, and that there are sort of pervasive barriers towards running. And so what she does is she goes about and runs her own focus group. So I don't have the actual focus group framework, but I'll walk you through how a focus group framework might work. And so what I've challenged you to do is to think about a research question that might be well suited to be answered via an interview of RMC cadets, because let's be honest, that's the population we have access to right now. So one of those research questions could be something like, why do so many students choose to order Domino's pizza? Like, what is it? There's a perfectly good cafeteria. Why are they ordering Domino's all the time? All right, so I might build my framework by starting off by introducing the topic and purpose. Maybe I would use a little deception that I'm mostly just interested in RMC students' food choices. I would create some sort of rules that would then guide that focus group. So because a focus group is a bunch of people talking together in a room, I would say, please only talk if you raise your hand, or, anything that you say in here will be recorded anonymously, or whatever your sorts of guidelines will be. And then having open-ended questions. And that's really key to have not just yes/no questions, because that you could get from a survey of RMC cadets, but really open-ended questions that can dig a little deeper into the topic. And consider ending with, if you could tell people in charge just one thing, what would that be, for example? That'll help you capture anything you might have missed. And you might be able to ask some questions of, tell me about your food choices. What do you normally eat? What about the hours of the calf? How often do you like to eat out? Those sorts of things. And then as a moderator, your job will be to keep track of time, make sure the discussion doesn't veer off course, and not let just a few people dominate the discussions. So if we were in class, we would try this. We would run a focus group, maybe not about pizza. I'd get you guys to come up with something maybe a little more relevant. But we can't really replicate that here. But if you ever get a chance to be in a focus group, just for learning, as a learning process, I'd really encourage it. And so like any other method of data collection, there are some pros and there are some cons. So let's just take a quick look at the pros and cons of focus groups. So the pros of focus groups, you can get really in-depth on an issue, and it can sometimes bring up issues that you didn't anticipate. So for example, if I'm interested initially at Domino's Pizza and then I find out everybody keeps talking about Little Caesars Pizza, I'm like, oh, I guess my assumption that this was all about them ordering in Domino's Pizza is not really the case. They actually really love Little Caesars, although I know better because I see the Domino's car come in all the time. But maybe the Little Caesars Pizza cars don't have a sign, and so I didn't even think to ask that. But then I do my focus group with the students, and they're like, Little Caesars this and Little Caesars that. So it can allow you to see things that you might not normally have anticipated to see. It can be economical and fast. So within the period of an hour of talking with you guys, I could get a sense of your food choices without having to individually interview each of you, and which would take like 27 hours instead. So it's pretty economical and fast. And the discussion can be really helpful. So if you have, people having an argument about Little Caesars versus Domino's being not important, but, the better pizza, then I'll be like, okay, so there's some disagreements within the cadet population about where the pizza should be coming from. Or, they might bring up calf hours that, like the reason we get pizza is because the cafeteria closes before our soccer practice is over, or whatever that happens to be. Downsides of using a focus group. People might not be entirely truthful if they don't trust the researchers or the other members of the group. So you might say, hey, you're my prof. I'm not telling you what kind of pizza I like. Totally fair. Ideally, well, also ethically, I would not be allowed to run a focus group on you guys for actual research because you're my students. But, you might be like, I don't know if I trust this person. Also, you might not trust other members of the group. So maybe, one of the members of the group, works at Domino's in the summers. And you're like, I don't want to say bad things about Domino's in front of them. Whereas if I was interviewing you directly, you could tell me all the terrible things about Domino's pizza. It's also really tough to do hypothesis testing. So just like interview research, which, you can do some hypothesis testing, but focus groups are very much well suited for the sort of inductive research that's going to build those extra research questions. So maybe after I find out about your pizza preferences and your love of Little Caesars, then I would go on to do a survey about people's pizza preferences. And, I might not have included Little Caesars on the list of different pizza places until you guys brought that up in the focus group. So it's a really good way of getting broad information that can help you formulate and test new hypotheses. All right, that was a lot of discussion about pizza. Okay, so the assignment this week is to do one or two. So I said, okay, let's try that again. So you have a choice between writing out an interview framework or writing out a focus group framework. So your interview framework is the first one. So what's the research question? Who are the subjects? So think of any sort of question in politics that might be well suited to answer with an interview framework. Feel free to add maybe like about 5 to 7 questions. Please, you don't need to go overboard. It's not a full research project like I did. And really you don't want to go overboard. So like I was doing a full research project and I only had 12 questions. I was talking to people for about an hour. So don't go overboard. Just give me a sense that you know how to build a good question. Hint, don't use yes or no questions. Hint, get questions that are really going to tap into the phenomena you're interested in looking at. And then give me a suggestion of where and when would you go and interview these people? How would you get access to these people? Oh, that's up here. So here would be more like when and where would be the best way to do it. The other option, so you can do one or you can do two. Number 2 is to build your own focus group. So think of a research question about politics that might be well suited to answer via an interview with RMC cadets. Actually, we should put a focus group via a focus group. Actually, I'm gonna remove that it has to be with RMC cadets. Just a general focus group in general, so it can be with anybody. How would you introduce the topic? What would be your rules and your guidelines for your group? And what would be the open-ended questions you would ask?